Malika, thank you so much for starting our day. It is an honor to have you a member of our community, and I will continue to make you come to these things until you refuse, and then I'll chase you down and you'll still have to come to the next one. But I'm so excited to introduce you and to have this conversation with my dear friend, Ellie Burke. Ellie, thank you for doing everything I ask of you at all times.
And I will never say no, so
okay,
you won't have to chase me down.
Well, I know where you live, so. I would love for you to start by talking about the work that you do in the world.
So Shannon, as you know, I'm a life coach. I'm also a yoga and meditation teacher. And really, if I were to have to sum up what I do, I am most interested in doing in the world is helping people recognize the unconscious ways in which they hold themselves back in the world, unconscious ways in which they operate in the world that ultimately causes them suffering, causes them not to be in a true place within themselves. So really, you know, I often joke with you that I'm a life coach and yoga teacher that often makes fun of life coaches and yoga teachers, and I don't say that in a mean way. It's just that there's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding about what it means to be an authentic human being and what it means to create a life that you want to live. It's often a misunderstanding because we think we have to change things outside of ourselves. And what I'm really most interested in is what we are changing within ourselves, which requires that we take a deeper look at those unconscious ways of operating and thinking.
Which is not always fun, but is required. I know. I mean, when I first ever had the idea that I wanted to hire a life coach, which was long before I met you, I thought that was the person that helps you get all the things you want, right? And then I actually hired a life coach, and I'm like, oh no, it's the person that helps you find clarity on what you actually need to feel the way you want to feel, which is not getting things that you want. So obviously, as a client of yours and a friend of yours, I understand this. I also, know that a lot of people find their way to this work because of their own struggle, whether it's anxiety or depression or traumatic experience. Many yoga teachers, meditation teachers find their way from a personal experience. So would you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So yeah, I mean, I think, the entry point to a deeper inner work is always our own human suffering. It's our personal suffering. The beauty of this work, though, I will say right at the beginning, is that even though I don't think that I fully ever recognized this until probably the past several years, with more committed work with my own teacher, is that as we work to heal ourselves, heal what is causing suffering, heal what keeps us separate within ourselves and the world, that ultimately that goes out into the world. So it becomes what motivates you eventually is no longer your own. In fact, you become more and more absent of your own suffering. But the wish to continue to do the work is to do it for the world, to do it for those who don't have the capacity, aren't able. So, I mean, I say this really lightly and jokingly that it's like Peter Parker's uncle told him, with great power comes great responsibility. But I do really believe that an inner work is a privilege, and it is also a responsibility. So my entry point, I would say I lived a lifetime of a very good life, but I also had a lot of experiences of just more mental health related issues throughout my lifetime, in particular my late teens, and then definitely my early 20s. I had some pretty hefty mental health things that were not really able to be diagnosed necessarily, and I also sort of self-willed my way out of a certain way of thinking. But all of that came flooding back to a massive degree after I gave birth to my twins about 9 years ago.
That'll do it.
That'll do it.
That will do it.
So I experienced a lot of postpartum anxiety, but also massive sleep deprivation over a long period of time, which around when they were about 10 months old, I had a total collapse, and was diagnosed with a mood disorder on the bipolar spectrum, which was what I believe a situational experience that then shifted the brain chemistry, the biochemistry in my body. So I tended to that, but at the same time, simultaneously started working with my meditation teacher. I'm no longer on medication, not that that's a thing, but ready to utilize it when in need of it. But through my work with my teacher and my understanding of just sort of the way our brains work, like how our thinking impacts our reality, our internal reality, which then impacts our external reality. Through that experience, I just did a lot of my own work and now feel just literally there's nothing else I can do in the world except for do this work and share that with whomever I can.
Yeah. I think it's so much of what you've said is so interesting in that I think people suffering often don't know why they're suffering. Mm-hmm. I know when I started working with you was similar experience of everything kind of coming to a head after experiencing postpartum depression. But I didn't know why I was upset or why I was so struggling at the time. And so I think it's so interesting that people still can find their way to supportive work without even really knowing what's wrong.
Yes, and what that points to, and I often talk about this with people that I work with, whether it's one-on-one or in groups, is that that's the part that we're actually connecting to, that part that knows, that says, I feel this way, and questions it, the questioning. So we attach to our experience, but then there's a part of us that's saying, that's sadness. That part knows that the sadness is counter to something other. If that makes sense. So even though we might not know or have even the faintest
like language to describe
language to describe, or even the strength to sort of go up against the experience of sadness or the experience of anxiety or the experience of whatever it is, the part that can see us in the experience has a knowing. And that's what often is the thing that gets us to say, I need support, or I need something. I need something. That's the thing that knows that experience, though feels real and is actually real, is also potentially grounded in something that's not as true as the part that has a knowing.
Yeah.
I know that sounds like way out there.
You know I'm with you. You know I'm totally on this Ellie Burke train. I think you had a yoga practice before you had your twins, but obviously, as you said, things change and shift, and your experience and what tools you're using changes as well. And I think meditation still for many is this kind of nebulous, not really sure if I'm doing it right. And even people that use meditation practice, I don't think always understand how it works and what they're using it for. I know for me, when I started to meditate, it was to turn off the swirly thoughts in my head. And I still think I struggle with understanding the body connectivity to meditation and how that can be important. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. Like what is the goal in the work as far as body awareness? How can we use it? How is it connected to meditation?
Sure. That's a great question. It's interesting, my journey of, I started yoga when I was pretty young, dove right into it. It allowed me to, although at the time I definitely had no sense of this, I can say it now, it allowed me to experience my body in my form. So it allowed me to go from here to here. A lot of us, I know especially me, I mean, I'm an intellectual, I like to learn, I read, conceptualize,
love talking, love swirling it around.
Yes, and as people, the way we get conditioned is when we learn to operate in a certain way, and that's received in the world in a certain way, and then we sort of modify and we go, oh, that's good here, and this is highlighted, and that's how so for me, my mind was always like a thing, and so I've always trusted that that's where I belong, that's what has the truth. So for the years that I practiced yoga, it was just a different experience. It's sort of like, I often say, BKS Iyengar has a quote that says, in this, we're seeking enlightenment, we're seeking bliss or whatever, but what we're seeking is consciousness or universe or God. And he often says, how can we know God if we don't know our pinky toe? Like if we can't feel our pinky toe, how do we expect that we could possibly experience?
I'm trying right now and I can't feel it. Damn it. All right, I'm going to work on it.
So when we utilize practices like yoga, it can be really kind of like mind blowing. It disrupts our mind because we're like, my hand is so alive. I had no idea. And
No, I
my
literally
breath.
never felt my hands until I went on your retreat. So weird.
It's amazing. And
I
you're
was
like,
a grown-up
and
then.
There are your hands.
So weird.
So through that journey, and then even, when I was teaching yoga and I had been taught many different types of meditation, it wasn't until I really began working with my own teacher around a particular way of practicing, which was not technique-based meditation. It's not about utilizing your mind to create an altered state, to try to access something. Often we'll hear, I need to meditate on that. And it's like, I'm going to take this thought and then I'm going to sit down and spin it around, which sometimes we can get some insight or see it differently, but that's always of the mind.
Not me.
Yeah, usually you
work.
can't. Usually you can't. It's those moments when often people say like, oh, it's just like I stepped outside or I went over here, I took a walk and then boom, it was there. The idea came or the insight or the shift. And that's actually precisely the moment where the mind drops out when that comes forward. And so if we're always utilizing the mind to try to do something, it can't drop out because we're using it. And that's really hard for the mind to understand. In fact, the mind can't really. So this is the tricky part about, I think, why people struggle with a meditation practice is because the mind is like, how am I doing this? What am I supposed to do? All the things. And that's why with the way that I've been taught and the way that I teach, it's a practice of utilizing your attention to bring it into the body, not just the body, but we're particularly talking about that right now, to drop the attention into the body, to notice sensation. You can notice the breath, whatever it is, but just to again and again and again to bring the attention in. I often refer lovingly to the mind as being like a very spoiled child, that all it knows is to have all of the attention. That's all it's ever known. And so the work is to notice that I can actually take my attention from here and whatever's happening, and I can turn it somewhere else. I can actually bring it to a different experience. But because the mind likes the attention, it's going to pull it back. It's going to pull it back in whatever way it can. And, people have experiences often in meditation where even they can have like scary thoughts or really vivid visualizations. Again, that's the mind just wanting to bring the attention back, to get the attention again. So utilizing the body as a way to meet awareness. The awareness exists in the body, using the attention to come into the form. So even right now, because I know you're working on it, I can see you.
You can see it in my face,
settling
concentrating on my hand.
It's not concentration.
Just feeling.
Just feeling.
Right.
And so simultaneously, you can experience the body. You can experience just a component of the body. And also, we're having a conversation.
Trying to.
Right,
holding
simultaneously.
It together. Okay.
Yeah.
I still can't feel my pinky toe, but it's a practice. I'll get there.
You will get there. And so the reason it's super important, the reason it's really important is because our mind is constantly generating material. Researchers have, we try to study the brain, obviously, and they have estimated that people have on average between 60 to 80,000 thoughts in a day. And some people are like, oh, I have way more than that. Other people are like, really? That's surprising.
Data people are like that.
Yeah. But what's really, really, really important to know is that only about 5% of those thoughts are conscious, meaning that we know that we are thinking them, which means that, and I can't do the math on that, but that's like
a lot.
Tens of thousands of thoughts that are unconsciously occurring.
Right.
Unconscious thoughts still impact us though. So just because we don't know that we're thinking, those thoughts do have an experience. They come down and have a lived experience in the body. So some are mild. It doesn't really matter that we're having those thoughts. They don't really trigger the body in any particular way. But also about 95% of the thoughts are repetitive and 80% of them are negative. So when we're having that number and that frequency of negative thoughts to any degree, that's trickling down into the body, activating the nervous system in a way that then impacts the way that we can then be in relationship to the world. So when our nervous system is activated, in particular the sympathetic nervous system, it's the part that's responsible for fight, flight, and freeze. When that activates, we're operating from stress. We're operating not in necessarily truth. So we can have conditioned thoughts that are creating an effect in the body, and then we're moving out into the world from that place, meaning we're not really meeting reality. If that makes sense. So until we can really feel this, we can't really begin to understand what's happening. We really can't. It's really, really important. And it can be so hard. People have a really hard time. Random, like people who've had pretty neutral lives have a hard time accessing the body, let alone people who've experienced trauma, people who've experienced hardship of any kind. It can be really difficult.
Are there
to access
people
the
that
form.
have not experienced hardship of any kind?
No.
I was going to say, I don't think that's
It's all
maybe
relative.
like 2 people.
Yeah. And even they've had their own relative hardship. So.
Right. Yeah, what I think about when we talk about this is a lot of people have like stress in their shoulders, right? Like they hold tension in their neck and shoulders. And it's right. Often you don't know you're doing that. It's just an effect that your body is reacting to whatever stresses are happening, whether they're conscious or not.
Yeah, and that actually coming back around to yoga, it's really interesting because people will often say, when I teach, I still teach occasionally, like once a week, but I always say like, what do we need to work on today so that I'm addressing what, it's fascinating because people will say like, oh, I feel it here, this is where I need, and what's really interesting is that they don't really need stretching. Yes, they do sometimes, right? Like the stretching doesn't hurt us at all. But what's really interesting is especially places where tension like builds, it's not that you need to stretch that muscle out. What needs to happen is the muscle needs to release the tension. Yeah. Again, which comes from a much more of an inner work than like, I'm gonna do this thing and like try to, pull that out. If that makes sense. So yeah, the body holds the material, it stores the material historically, as we've even learned more recently in epigenetics that like, our bodies store material from generations before we even had this lifetime, which is wild.
It sure is. Good luck. No, just kidding. Just kidding. We're optimistic here.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really interesting, and I've done with you and with other teachers body awareness exercises, and like at specific times used it. I'm sure I learned this from you of understanding like what feels expansive and what feels like a collapse.
Yeah.
And I know that's a really great tool to use when making decisions, but I also imagine it's probably a really great tool right now when we need awareness now more than ever to be able to open ourselves to understanding and to learning.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the two, if you're looking at sort of like a spectrum, which again, I realize this is conceptual, and I know I would like to try to incorporate at the end of this a little bit of experiential learning.
Done.
But the conceptual understanding is sort of a spectrum of expansiveness and then contraction, being at this state. So complete expansiveness is our natural state as conscious beings, right?
Whoa.
But we are human beings, so we have the human material and our identities and our personalities and all of that. The farther we get towards contraction, the more solid we feel and more rigid we feel in that form, which is based off of ego and wanting to know we exist in this space. So if you're looking at contraction to expansion, most of us exist like in here somewhere. And often in practices like yoga, or really honestly, I think musicians experience this, I think artists experience it, I think people experience it in many forms, which is sort of when I disappear, right? This art form is expressing or this movement is occurring, but sort of I'm disappearing and there's the flow, there's this more spacious, expansive quality. But where that's really useful, it's helpful to have a seated practice that we can begin to explore. It's like we only know what we know, right? So as we go like, I just had an experience where I felt entirely expansive. So now I know that that's a possibility.
Right.
But what that allows us to do, actually, it's not that we're always seeking that. It can allow us to then recognize when we are in contraction, when we are separating, when we are moving away from discomfort. And one of the things that you mentioned, sort of the collapse. So as human beings, we're wired to move away from discomfort. It's just our natural mechanism for living in the world and to survive. So we're wired to not be in discomfort. We have to move away from it. We have different tendencies, from my understanding, in my own experiences. One is to collapse away. That can feel like a separation. It can feel like a depressive quality, like I can't meet life. I'm sort of shutting down. The other one is like, I'm out here and I'm going to work and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. It's like a hyperactive, like I've got to do. And this is not a work that means don't do, right? Of course we should be doing in the world, but it's about sort of coming into a more neutral place that is neither collapsed nor overdoing. But again, in that more neutral, and I say neutral not because the experience is neutral, it's just literally like a center point. We actually have to have the experience with whatever it is, and we don't want to. Our minds don't want to, our emotions don't want to, because a lot of times there's pain in it. So as we're talking about, I mean, obviously tremendous amount of pain being experienced on all levels right now. And so our, that movement away from the discomfort is simply creating more separation. So to understand within yourself, am I contracting right now? Am I expanding? Am I closer to truth? Am I closer to separation, which is illusion? And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that from let's just go bliss out. But the recognition of the absolute reality. Ruth King, who's a woman who I have studied, and she has a book called Mindful of Race. It's a great book. But she talks about understanding absolute reality, which is connectivity, oneness, does not dismiss relative reality, which is that we are operating here and now in these forms. This is how I show up in the world, and that's a very different experience than other people have. And so understanding that can't deny the relative reality that is dealt with on a daily basis, because we are human. Most of us don't have the ability to exist in a space where we are just doing consciousness work and, sitting in a ashram. Right.
We've talked about that.
Yeah.
I was like, I know I can't go off the grid and just live on pine cones. I have to, I want to experience this life in the community that I'm in. I just want to be in better relationship to that community and to myself.
Yes. And this
is different. This is not an
totally
escape.
different. This is not an escape. In fact, it is about learning to be in it and be in relationship to what is. You can't be in relationship to what is if you're leaving it. If you're constantly moving away from this moment, there's no way to meet reality as it is. And if we're not able to be in it and actually meet what it is, and we talk about this, but the word acceptance is a little weird. Acceptance is, I see things as they are, actually, not my history, not my conditioning, not my perception, but I'm seeing things as they are. It's only then that we have the potential to see a path forward, to see what's possible. And so, yeah, absolutely.
So can we do it?
Yeah, so and I'll just mention really quickly too, it's interesting because even modern yoga as we know it yoga was actually dying off in India tremendously. And there was a movement of teachers that were prior to it coming to the West even that said this has to be is the yoga for the householder, yoga for the marketplace, yoga for the people that are in the world. Of the world. And this is exactly what this type of meditation practice and this way of understanding unconscious thinking is attempting to do. It is because this is where most of us are. We're in lives, we're doing work, we're in relationships, we're in communities. Right. And there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot that needs to be, changed in the world. And so in order to do that, we have to be in it. We have to be in relationship to it.
Yeah. I'm in.
Yeah.
All right. You ready to do it?
I'm ready.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so if you're joining us at home, I hope you can just take a few moments to do this experiential learning. We only truly learn from experience. So I would encourage you to sit with us for just a moment, but sit comfortably. So actually even Shannon, I'm going to have you sit back against the back of the chair, just to find the support of the body. So just letting your hands rest together in the lap, feet on the floor. Closing the eyes as you're ready and just very swiftly gathering your attention from wherever it is and bringing it into the body. So you can come in by way of the hands, noticing first the aliveness there, just noticing the points of contact between the hands and allowing the awareness to enter the body and drop down to the seat. So just feel down into the support of the seat beneath you. And as you feel the support underneath of you as well as in your back body, allow yourself to rest down into that support just a little bit more. So just noticing even now if there's anything that is bracing, anything that is contracting. That bracing, that efforting, that contracting is moving you away from this moment. And it can be in response to this current experience, but often it's habitual. It's just a habituated way that we operate. So just looking for that and softening that in whatever way you're able to. So as you notice bracing and allow for it to soften, allow the attention to grow to include more of the experience inside of the body. Just noticing whatever it is that's available for you to notice. There are sensory experiences throughout the body. There's the movement of the breath. You don't need to control the breath. You're being breathed in this moment. Just allowing that to occur. And then allowing the attention to grow and expand beyond the form to include the external. So this is an important component. We are including the external. So we are aware of the internal environment as well as the external, just allowing the sounds to move to you and pass through you. So the attention can grow and it expands, it shifts to awareness. Awareness can be in all of those places, inside and out at the same moment. So even for just a few moments, resting there, resting in the body and resting back in the awareness. Sensing that there's a little bit more spaciousness inside. Awareness is the quality of expansiveness. So as you softly open the eyes, just gazing downwards for a moment, still sensing inside of the body. Stay awake to that sensation, even as you move out with the eyes. You can lift the gaze slowly.
So good. You know, it was so funny. I had a thought pop up about what's next. Obviously, I know it's supposed to be in the moment, but I was thinking about what's next, and I got like a nice little flutter in my chest thinking about the next speakers that we have.
Yeah, so it's not always negative experiences.
It's not. I know, that's so rare, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Feel it?
but to be able to have the space to see, oh, there's a thought, and this is how it affected my body. Because normally we're just not aware of that.
Clearly.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Ellie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Always,
I appreciate it.
Always for being here. And thank you for being here and watching and following along our next segment. I'm so excited to introduce to you three people who I admire very, very much. Christy Thompson is going to be in conversation with Pia Silva and Rachel Cook, who everyone knows I adore with my whole soul. And we're going to be talking about productivity and creating our own space and our own way of working. So please stay on here.